Hello, Megan and Karina. Thanks for joining us. In some conversations that we were having about the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, I know some new information came to light about the relationship between Reach Up and EITC, and so I was just hoping you'd comment to tell the committee about it, and then I have a question or two, but another people can call. So thanks so much for joining us. I know you have a presentation. If you want to share the screen and share it, you're welcome to.
Okay, I'm happy to share my screen, and I wanted to say thank you for having us in your committee today. We're not often in House Ways and Means, so do forgive us if this is too much of an overview, but I did want to take a moment to talk through what DCF does and our different divisions, because that factors into when we're talking about the EITC, what it means for different divisions in our department. So with that, I will share.
Well, if you could both identify yourselves for the record, that would be great.
Oh, my apologies. I'm Katarina Lasias. I'm the Senior Advisor to the Commissioner at the Department for Children and Families.
I'm Megan Smeaton. I am the Financial Director, CFO for DCF.
Thanks.
All right. So the Department for Children and Families mission is to foster the healthy development, safety, and well-being and self-sufficiency of Vermonters. We do that in 6 offices and divisions across our department. So we have the Child Development Division, which your committee has been hearing about, because that's where child care sits in state government. We have our Economic Services Division, which is where Reach Up, when we talk about TANF, the Temporary Aid to Needy Families federal funding, that's the division that program fits in, as well as 3 Squares, LIHEAP, the GA program, which is commonly called the Hotel and Motel program, are all part of Economic Services. The Family Services Division helps youth and children who are perhaps in the custody of the state, could be in the custody of the state, focuses on juvenile justice and support. And then we also have 3 offices, which are the Office of Child Support, which is predominantly federally funded and helps families who are or are paying child support. And we have the Office of Disability Determination, which is almost exclusively federally funded as well, which helps with Medicaid and Social Security disability determination. And we have the Office of Economic Opportunity, which provides funding to help organizations address poverty through community initiatives and direct services. So this is where a lot of federal and state funding goes to community action agencies in all of your regions across the state, as well as homeless shelter service providers, and we have our weatherization program there. So the Reach Up program helps eligible parents gain job skills, find work so they can support their children. This looks like education and employment supports, case management supports, and monthly cash payments to help pay for basic necessities. I raise all of these things to share with you today because our Reach Up program exceeds the federal requirements for the TANF funding. We have a very flexible Reach Up program serving the needs of the families who are eligible in that of the services. Last year, you all passed a bill that's now Act 133 that further provides some flexibility in our Reach Up program. So more things can be eligible for work requirements. We now call it universal engagement in our program, or we'll call it in January. So this is the historic caseload in the Reach Up program. I'm gonna, you have access to the slides, so I'm just gonna skip over it. This is just some background on our Reach Up program. Right now, we have about 3,400 families being served by the Reach Up program. This, just for background, is what someone is paid per month, the maximum benefit of what someone is paid per month in the program if you're receiving the cash assistance. So the household size and the funding amount. This is the Reach Up funding for the program. So in total, there's about $35.6 million. You'll see on this chart, which Megan will help explain in the coming pages, that most of Reach Up is general fund. That's because we perform some of these swaps with our federal fund that comes in to get general fund to then have as much flexibility in the program that I was just mentioning. And now I'll pass it to you, Megan.
Thank you. So as we were talking about Reach Up, TANF is a common word that comes up in that realm. And so we wanted to give you some background on TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF. The Vermont has an award of $47 million. This is a capped federal funding source, so we can't earn any more than $47 million of TANF funding. We can take up to 30% of this funding and convert it into other federal funding. Basically, we can decide to use up to 30% in manners that would align with CCDF or SSBG. This is helpful because CCDF has more flexible eligibility requirements than TANF, and that's the Child Care Development Fund. The remaining $33 million is available for TANF eligibility expenses across all of DCF. Simultaneously, we have to meet a state maintenance of effort, or an MOE, for TANF to be able to draw in that full federal award. Many federal, saying something? No, okay. Many federal funding sources have a percent match. So basically, like, if you spend $10, 50% of it has to be met with state funds and 50% of it can be federal funds. TANF is a little bit different in that we have to show that we're meeting spending that is tied to our 1994 state expenses on eligible TANF funds, TANF expenses. So this year we have a $25.5 million MOE that we have to meet to be able to fully draw in that $47 million. Go to the next one. This shows you how our TANF funding is spread out across our department. We have $2.2 million for administrative expenses. About $600,000 goes to CDD. FSD gets about $8.3 million of the TANF award. We have $2.7 million going to Reach Up. $600,000 goes to AHS for some agency-wide expenses. And then we have that $13.9 million of transfers to CCDF and SSBG that allow us to use those expenses more flexible, those federal funds more flexibly. The remaining $18.8 million is what we call the EITC swap. And I will explain that in the next slide. So how does the TANF swap work? Basically, the tax department sends out the earned income tax credits to Vermonters, and then they report that to DCF every quarter. We then apply a statistic that determines the eligible TANF expenses. Not all people are eligible not all the earned income tax credits that go out are eligible to go on our TANF report. Once we apply the statistic, we report that total on our federal TANF reports, and then AHS draws in that federal revenue. The federal revenue then goes to the tax department to cover those expenses. And they've already incurred the expenses, so it's just basically backfilling those expenses. And then they transfer to DCF on a one-to-one basis, state funds or special funds in this case, that allows DCF to cover our maintenance, a large portion of our maintenance of effort, and provide more flexibility in the Reach Up program. Now, if EITC increases, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can increase the amount of TANF that we're drawing in. Not all EITC increases and expansions would be federally eligible. They must meet the TANF eligibility requirements. And then on top of that, we have to apply the statistic. So we have right now, about 91.1% of the EITC expenses that the tax department reports to us end up drawing in federal revenue. The other thing to note is that EITC is a capped funding source, as I said earlier. So if we were to increase the amount of EITC or TANF going to support EITC in the tax department, that would just mean less available TANF for DCF programs. And I believe that is the end of our slide.
Could you say that last thing again, because I didn't quite get it.
Yes, excuse me. Yes, if we have a capped federal funding source, it's $47 million. So if we increase that bottom wedge of the chart to be, say, $21 million, so we're, adding $1.2 million to it, that would mean that we would have to take $1.2 million from one of the other wedges to cover that increase. So it might mean that FSD is now only getting $7.1 million. That if we're doing a swap, right? If we're increasing the swap with the tax department, we would just be backfilling that with state funds, but no additional funding would be earned anywhere in the process. It would just be moving what funds hit where.
And this, I just want to confirm, this doesn't, if we increase the EITC overall in Vermont, that wouldn't negatively impact our revenues. It's just that we can't create any brand new federal money coming down out of increasing the EITC.
Correct. So we would not be able to create any more federal revenue. And if we're sending more federal revenue to the tax department for TANF, then there's less available to DCF and they'd have to transfer. The swap would just get to be larger, but no additional funds would be generated.
And then I think the issue that sort of sparked my discovery, at least, of this swap was a conversation about possibly expanding the state EITC to folks who don't have social security numbers in Vermont, which we know would have a fairly de minimis fiscal impact in Vermont just because there aren't that many people like that here in Vermont. But my understanding is that you have some concerns about how it might impact the swap. And I guess what I want to understand is it just that those folks' dollars would not be eligible for the swap, or are you concerned that it would make us ineligible for the swapping in general?
I think the former. So a child without a social security number wouldn't be eligible for the federal funding in the swap. So that would have to become part of the statistic that the formula that Megan was speaking of, but it would not upend the EITC program because there's other state funds within that.
Okay, and since I imagine if the proportions change significantly of non-social security numbers and social security numbers, it might have an impact, but right now we're well past our max, right?
I think that's probably a question for tax, but our multiplier is less than their full award.
Okay.
Yeah. Right, Megan?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions for anyone about this fun little tiny corner? Yes.
So I'm sorry about. Are we already receiving as much money as we can from the federal government? We are. So there's no way to increase that.
No, we've drawn the max federal award annually.
Okay.
And while a topic for the federal government, it has not increased in 25 years.
Thank you.
There's an issue.
That is helpful to know as well. Thank you very much.
We actually had a slight decrease several years ago.
Yes.
It's a little corner, but it's still interesting.
It is an interesting one, yeah. There was a brief moment where I thought maybe there was this magic source of new federal money, but in fact, no.
Defense Department couldn't afford it.
Anything else on this issue?
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for joining us and coming to Ways and Means and this sort of unusual stuff. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks for hearing about DCF.
We appreciate that. We appreciate all the work you do. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
So in a deep switching of gears. So we've heard testimony and everyone is coughing so much today, and I'm gonna offer my cough drops around the room for the whole committee. Okay, and maybe it's good that we're gonna spend a few days away from each other. So, we've taken testimony in bits and pieces about this small paragraph of language that Maria shared with us that moved from a tax on telephone charges for USF to her language. We've heard testimony about it earlier in the week and last week, but we're doing it in tiny little bits and pieces, such as the end of the session scheduling. And so today we have Mr. Rob Vitsky. Did I say that right?
I'll take it.
Who's the director of the Vermont Communication Union District Association, to add some more testimony to that conversation.
Great. Thank you all for having me. I understand you've had a busy morning, so one more little topic, and I promise to keep it short. And
I'm so grateful that you had time to come and talk to us. Thank you.
oh, absolutely a pleasure, of course. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of insight from our perspective on this change, which generally we view.
Before you jump in, can you introduce yourself both for the record and so I can pronounce your last name better next time?
Absolutely. So I am Rob Vitsky, and I am staff to the Vermont Communications Union District Association. And so VCUDA is the association of the 10 municipal CUDs in Vermont that are building broadband. And essentially, VCUDA as an organization works to kind of unify some of the policy and shared resource demands across the CUDs. So I've been doing this for since August of last year, and it's actually quite a pleasure to work with the VCUDA team and to have opportunities like this to talk about the progress we're making in Vermont. So just to give you a little bit of background, I know probably many of you were involved in this, but I know we also have some new members, and so we're trying to talk a little bit about what the CUDs are. So the communications union districts are multi-town municipalities. They are formed by a vote of each town meeting, or in some cases, representatives of the town meeting to join a communications union district. Each town appoints representatives that serve in the governance of the CUD and directly participate in many cases in everything from business plans to technical to marketing, et cetera. The CUDs were founded to be committed to universal service. And in fact, our business model is an exact flip of what you see in the commercial sector. We go to the unserved addresses first, and then we go to the underserved next. And so, this is really focused on getting to those addresses that have been left behind across Vermont and making sure that they have world-class broadband. We, as organizations, like to think that we operate with accountability and transparency. We obviously include deep representation from our communities in the way we do our business. And although we operate in a competitive environment, we are deeply committed to principles of public ownership and working deeply with our communities to meet those unserved needs. Finally, as you think about CUDs, it's important to remember we work with private partners. And so while the ownership of the assets and the governance is deeply rooted in the communities, we work with people who do this all the time to help implement the actual services. And so private partnership is very important to the way the CUDs operate. So our interest in Vermont Universal Service, communications union districts already serve about 18,000 addresses or pass by them in Vermont. EC Fiber's been doing this for some time, and the bulk of those addresses are there, but increasingly, there are hundreds of addresses in each of the other communications union districts, and more homes being passed all the time. We offer voice services on top of the broadband services we provide. And for some customers, that's obviously very important that they have an option to continue to have a landline in their home. And there are about 5,000 of those that the CUDs provide today across Vermont. We actually see this for the CUDs as a growth opportunity as we pass more addresses. This ratio is about a third, but somewhere between a third and a half of the homes that we pass as they pick up, fiber-based broadband at their home will consider taking on voice service. So I'm not going to read this, but I will say that as we talk about our comments, there's a little bit of our question in some of the red language here that we want to just point out to you. One word in particular, the simultaneously accessing the 911 system was a little confusing to us. But in general, we're very supportive of this. Of course, supporting the Vermont Universal Service Fund and its support of E911 is critical to the state. It's in the public interest to continue this. And we certainly recognize that as the packaging of voice services and all the different technologies have changed over time, that the percentage-based allocation can be problematic. And so, we certainly are supportive of the idea that we need to restructure the funding for E911 and universal service and repoint it towards the future. This is, of course, when you hear about this, the places where you go on what could go wrong are that you don't want to create a regressive system that taxes, the elderly or the most rural who need that landline for connectivity. And so I think the language that's here, which talks about a broader base of all the different types of folks that use telephone numbers, is really important and is the right way to go. So there are other E911, there are other considerations beyond E911 that certainly are on folks' radar. And, as this fund gets discussed over time, there are things like affordable and universal connectivity programs. Right now, we benefit from a federal program called the ACP, which is providing subsidies to Vermonters to help them access broadband services. There's some question about whether or not that federal program will go away. And certainly, having a strategy in Vermont to help folks that can't afford a standard broadband subscription is something that in the future will need consideration. That said, we do support the language that's here, particularly the Black language. We would call attention in the language to the sentence that was added in red that says essentially the number of lines that will be charged the 70 cents are the lines that will be capable of simultaneously accessing the 911 system. And the word simultaneously is the one that we really question there. There's not a one-to-one ratio between the number of phone numbers, the number of people that can answer the phone at a given time, the number of trunks between the different providers and the 911 system. And so that word simultaneously, we were worried could be read to constrain the number of eligible phone numbers that would be paying into the fund. And our take is it should be universal.
I believe that it was actually designed to constrain the number of phone numbers to create clarity for large call centers or say a hospital or university system who might have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of phone numbers, but only sort of a certain number can call out. There was also some conversations around does a line that connects, say, an ATM to a bank, but no humans can communicate on, count as a phone line? So that's the context for that, but we are certainly open to feedback given that context.
Great, that's very helpful. We were thinking about provider to provider kind of constraints where that your clarification, for instance, the hospital trunk lines makes a lot of sense. So I imagine we would agree with that, the context that you set, and just want to protect for the other context that we came up with.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's great. We certainly support a longer term, more comprehensive look at ways that this fund could be used and some of the needs for things like universal access. And so to the extent that you would consider some kind of longer term study of the needs for affordable access and universal service, we certainly would appreciate that in the future. And I think that's really it. Again, we're very supportive of the structural change, and we just want to make sure it includes the broadest number of phone numbers, of course, with the exception of, I agree with you on the hospital trunk lines. Makes a lot of sense to limit it there.
Thank you. Really appreciate your testimony. There's a lot of telecom related statute, tax statute that has not been touched in a very long time. And so I think we're trying to find our way to the best way to solve short-term immediate problems while making space for long-term solutions. And so I'm hoping that we can take some testimony on the bigger picture in the next few weeks before we adjourn for the year. We would love for you to come back and be part of that conversation as well.
Great, thank you.
Representative Anthony?
Yes, thank you. I couldn't agree more. Trying to locate a segment of the market that would allow the system and the revenue to grow as the need grows would be ideal without running up against the preemption issues of taxing telecom, which Congress has said you cannot do. But that's the fine line that I think we ought to be walking. Thank you.
Yeah, and just recognizing that the way we receive information and what we receive in what line has really changed a lot in the last several decades. And it certainly feels appropriate to me that we revisit the existing taxes and fees and modernize that to reflect the different ways that we get different services. But appreciate that we're able to have this immediate conversation about we have a special fund with declining revenue because of some of those shifts, and what can we do right now to stabilize that fund to continue to provide the broadband funding and E911 services.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Rob, do you know if Mr. Flynn will be able to join us?
He's not. He was going to be
Okay.
here in case you had
Okay.
questions, but we are always available,
Okay.
and we're happy to come back anytime. Just one comment. There is a changing landscape around the understanding of the federal preemption, and I know that some other states in New England, Maine, and Connecticut in particular, are looking at ways, particularly on the angle of consumer protection. There's a big court case out of California recently. And so there is still a preemption of certain taxes, but there are opportunities emerging around consumer protection, and some of these issues probably fit into that category.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you, guys.
Oh, sorry, one second.
If you have some suggested language other than simultaneously access,
Yes, I'll go back to the group now that we understand what was intended there, and we'll see what we can do.
that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great morning.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. See you